So coming to the third part, guys, that is hindgut and urogenital system. So let's now talk about the hindgut part and also about the urogenital system. Well, these two will go hand in hand. If you remember from the very first picture we discussed in this GIT embryology, when we talked about the folding of the embryo. So we said hindgut is having a ventral extension. Now, let me start from that point only. That was a hindgut, and here is the ventral extension from the hindgut, and that is called as what? Allantois. So this obviously is the hindgut part. The extension is the allantois. Allantois actually gives rise to the bladder in lower animals like birds. The allantois form the entire bladder in birds, but in human we just have the remnant. And if you remember, the portion below the allantoic diverticulum, this portion was the cloaca. Right? This portion was the cloaca part here. And this cloaca or this portion of the hindgut is going to be divided in two parts by a septum called as a urorectal septum. But even before I talk about the urorectal septum, from the general embryology, do you remember what was the membrane present at the caudal end of embryo? That was a cloacal membrane. Is cloaca here? And that membrane was a cloacal membrane. So let us say, guys, this here is the cloacal membrane. If I say this is the cloacal membrane. So what is now going to happen? That there is a septum which will develop. Now look at this arrow here that is representing the septum. The septum will grow and this divides the cloaca in two parts. That's how it is going to grow. And this septum is made up of extra embryonic mesoderm. This is made up of extra embryonic mesoderm. The septum is called as urorectal septum. This septum is referred as a urorectal septum. It is dividing the urinary bladder, the future urinary bladder, to the future rectum and anal canal. So we call it urorectal septum. So once this urorectal septum, which as I already said, is made up of extra embryonic mesoderm. Remember extra embryonic mesoderm, which was all around the yolk sac. So that extra embryonic mesoderm. And once this urorectal septum will completely divide this cloaca part, now we have the two different entities. This anterior part, look at where I'm highlighting here. This anterior part, guys, this will be called as a urogenital sinus. Because that portion of the cloaca will give rise to the urinary structure, like bladder, and to some genital structures also. The genital ducts will come into it. And the posterior part here will be called as primitive rectum. So let me draw that next picture. So what I'm saying is that the next image would be something like this. This is the portion which is the anterior part with the allantois, and that is a posterior part, the primitive rectum part. So the septum has already grown inside. I'm not drawing it again. And even the membrane is divided in two parts. The cloacal membrane itself is divided in two parts as well. Look at that. So now we have two different entities, guys. This is called as the primitive rectum, the one that you see behind. This is the primitive rectum. And the one here, this is called as the urogenital sinus. We have a pelvic part, we have a phallic part of that. Pelvic part is above, phallic part is below. So that is urogenital sinus. Allantois will be obliterated and will give rise to urachus. And we have a remnant, that obliterated allantois or the urachus, that forms a ligament in human, and that ligament is called as a median umbilical ligament. That is median umbilical ligament. If you look at the bladder, at the apex of the bladder, there is a ligament called as median umbilical ligament. We do have a medial umbilical ligament also, but this is median, and in the middle goes to the umbilicus. And if this urachus is patent, let's say, if this urachus is patent, then the bladder will be seen having a connection directly to the umbilicus. That leads to the weeping umbilical cord. If there is a patency of this urachus, that can lead to the weeping umbilical cord. The urine can be dribbling out of this umbilical opening. So now we already divided this in two parts. This is the urogenital sinus, which is present anteriorly, and primitive rectum behind. And not only this, we have membrane divided in two parts. Now the membrane in front, that membrane is also called as the urogenital membrane. This membrane is urogenital membrane, and the one behind that is called as the anal membrane, because it obviously will contribute to the formation of anal canal. So it all started with that hindgut part having the allantoic diverticulum. The portion below that allantoic diverticulum was cloaca. The cloaca was divided in two parts. Anterior part is urogenital sinus, posterior part is primitive rectum. And urogenital sinus, as we just said, we'll discuss more, will give rise to the urinary and genital structures. Primitive rectum obviously will give rise to rectum. But what about anal canal? If I do it here itself, guys, anal canal. If you look at the anal canal, well, the main landmark that we have in the anal canal, that is the dentate line, which is the lower limit for all these. That is a dentate line, which is a lower limit for the anal columns, anal valve, anal sinuses, right? All these things. And this part, which is above the dentate line, all these anal canal, portion over the dentate line, that is which is having all these sinuses, anal valve, and everything. They're all derived from primitive rectum. They're all derived from primitive rectum. And see where the primitive rectum is coming from. Primitive rectum is from the hindgut. Hindgut, remember, it was from the yolk sac. And yolk sac is what? Endodermal. So this portion of the anal canal is endodermal part, which is contributed by the primitive rectum. On the other hand, anal membrane, which is coming from cloacal membrane. So this anal membrane will form the lower part of the anal canal, and that part is the ectodermal part of the anal canal. That will give rise to the ectodermal part of the anal canal. So above the dentate line, everything that we have, as we said, the columns, valve, sinuses, they're all endodermal. And everything below the dentate line will be ectodermal, and there is an ectoderm of the anal membrane, which is ultimately coming from cloacal membrane. So that is about the anal canal. For the urogenital sinus, now we have to discuss it separately. Let me take you back to something where we talked about the intermediate mesoderm, where we said there are three types of mesoderm. We have paraaxial, intermediate, lateral plate mesoderm, and we did not talk much about the intermediate mesoderm. We just wrote that intermediate mesoderm will give rise to some urinary structure, some genital structure, urogenital system, and this sinus is urogenital sinus only. So now this is time to connect that intermediate mesoderm we discussed in the general embryo to this urogenital sinus, and let's find out how exactly there is a development of kidney to the uterus, vagina, all will developing from this part itself. That will do it in this next section. To discuss the development of the urogenital system, the two important things which are required. One is the urogenital sinus, we just talked about it. And one was the intermediate mesoderm, which we talked about when we saw that how the intraembryonic mesoderm divides into paraaxial, intermediate, and lateral plate mesoderm. So guys, for the development of the urogenital system, as I said, one we need is the urogenital sinus. Urogenital sinus, obviously it is endodermal. Urogenital sinus was a part of the hindgut, so it is endodermal. And another thing that we need here is the intermediate mesoderm. That is intermediate mesoderm. Why this intermediate mesoderm? What this intermediate mesoderm will do? Intermediate mesoderm will further divide in or give rise to two things. One is the genital ridge. One is the genital ridge, and also the nephrogenic cord. Genital ridge and nephrogenic cord. These are the two parts which we need to focus at for now. Genital ridge and the nephrogenic cord. Well, genital ridge will give rise to what? If you remember, we talked about this. We use this term in the general embryo also. Genital ridge is to give rise to the gonads. Testis and ovary will be derived from this genital ridge or gonads, that is intermediate mesoderm. Whereas the nephrogenic cord, as the name suggests, nephrogenic cord is the part from where all this kidney and other things will develop. So nephrogenic cord is the portion which will divide into the pronephros and mesonephros and metanephros, and then other that we'll see that how exactly the kidney will come into the picture. So I can say nephrogenic cord is a portion from where the future kidney, even ducts like mesonephric duct, paramesonephric duct, all these events will take place, their formation event will take place in the nephrogenic cord. So let us understand what we have and how exactly it will act to form this genital system and urinary system as well. Now look at me. Let's say these are the two intermediate mesoderm we have, like this one intermediate mesoderm here and one here on the posterior wall, posterior embryonic wall, starting all the way from the cervical region till lower down. So that is intermediate mesoderm. And then we have urogenital sinus present in front. We just said hindgut is divided into two parts by the urorectal septum. So it is divided by the urorectal septum in what two parts? Anterior was the urogenital sinus and posterior was the rectum. So urogenital sinus relatively is present in front. And we have the two intermediate mesoderm which is on the posterior wall. So let us say if mesonephric duct develops in this intermediate mesoderm, in the nephrogenic cord more precisely, that mesonephric duct or paramesonephric duct will go into the urogenital sinus from which wall? From the posterior wall. And that is why the trigone of the bladder is seen in the posterior wall, because all the absorption of these ducts are taking place from the posterior aspect only. So it's imperative to understand that what the raw material we have with us. So I'm going very schematically about it. Let us say this is a nephrogenic cord of one side. Let's keep it very simple. That is nephrogenic cord of the other. So this whole thing here is a nephrogenic cord. Let me write in short now. That is nephrogenic cord. What is nephrogenic cord? It's apart from the intermediate mesoderm. So there is a nephrogenic cord. And this here is the urogenital sinus, which is in front. Let me put it like this. This is a urogenital sinus. Urogenital sinus, which is all about endoderm. So this is something which is to be decided in the beginning only. This is intermediate mesoderm. If nephrogenic cord is an intermediate mesoderm, that means anything which will develop in the nephrogenic cord will be mesodermal only. And similarly, urogenital sinus comes from where? Comes from the cloaca. Cloaca from the hindgut from the gut from the yolk sac, and yolk sac is endodermal. So just keep that in mind, that whatever we're going to discuss, we have the two main components here. One is mesodermal and one is endodermal. In the development of kidney, they say that ontogeny repeats phylogeny. When the development of kidney begins, it's not the human kidney which directly comes into the existence. The very first primitive type of kidney, which actually develops in the cervical region, cervical part of this nephrogenic cord, called as a pronephros part. That is more of a kidneys in fishes, which obviously will not work for the human. The second type of kidney, which is more effective than the pronephric kidneys, is more like amphibian kidney. That is from the mesonephros, will develop from the thoracolumbar region of the nephrogenic cord. That will also not be successful because there is one issue with the mesonephric kidney. There is no reabsorption possible in the mesonephric kidneys. No peritubular capillaries, no vasa recta. So that is not possible. And that is why the human kidney finally developed from the caudal part of nephrogenic cord. That is the metanephros part of this nephrogenic cord. So that also explains you that why kidney develops in the pelvic fossa, because the kidney developing in the upper primitive cervical region and the primitive thoracolumbar region fails, and the successful human kidney is metanephric kidneys, which is from the caudal part of nephrogenic cord. So guys, let's presume this is the cranial part of nephrogenic cord, that is the pronephros. The middle part of nephrogenic cord, that is the mesonephros. Well, I said Mesonephric kidneys will not be successful in human, but that doesn't mean the mesonephros is not successful at all. Mesonephros gives rise to mesonephric duct, and then we have paramesonephric duct. So mesonephros is very much needed in human, but when it comes to kidney will not develop from the mesonephros. It is from what part? It is from this caudal part of the nephrogenic cord, which will be separated entirely, and we call it what? Metanephros. That is a metanephros part. So let's say this here is the metanephros part from where the kidneys will develop. We'll discuss that eventually. And that is the reason human kidneys are also called the metanephric kidneys. They develop from metanephros, so we call it metanephric kidneys. Well, we'll come back to that point. Now, mesonephros, we said mesonephros will give rise to the mesonephric duct and paramesonephric duct also. So guys, let us say, if this is a mesonephric duct here, now the mesonephric duct will come from this mesonephros and will come forward and get absorbed in the urogenital sinus later on, and that will give rise to the trigone of the bladder. That will give rise to the tricone of the bladder. So I can say, in the initial development, this here is a trigone of the bladder. I can say that this duct, this is called as a mesonephric duct. As you can see, it is descending from the mesonephros. It is formed in the mesonephros. So this duct here is a mesonephric duct. Let me highlight that for you. That is a mesonephric duct, very important. And this mesonephric duct will eventually get absorbed into the urogenital sinus to form the trigone of the bladder. But that is like a next step. I mean, I'm just going in a retrograde manner. But when it comes to the development of the kidney, I saw this trigone first. But when you look at the kidney, we said kidney will develop from metanephros. Now, how it will develop from metanephros? There is one bud which you will see extending from this mesonephric duct, and that bud will go back and invade the metanephros. I'm going to draw it separately, just to show you that how this bud will come out. This bud is called as a ureteric bud. This bud here is called as a ureteric bud. And you can see the ureteric bud invading into the metanephros part above. Let me just take this portion here separately so that I can explain you this thing even better. So guys, if this is the metanephros part, if this here is a metanephros part, let me give the same color to that. That is the metanephros. From above, we have that mesonephric duct coming, right? Let me draw it with a lumen. So let's say there's a mesonephric duct here. And we just said that mesonephric duct will give rise to this bud called as a ureteric bud, which goes back and invade the metanephros. This is the mesonephric duct. This obviously is a metanephros, no doubt about that. And this bud here is that is a ureteric bud. And once this ureteric bud invade the metanephros, this metanephric tissue present around this ureteric bud, it starts proliferating. And this proliferating metanephric tissue, guys, this is called as the metanephric. This is called as the metanephric blastema. This is referred as the metanephric blastema. So basically, for the development of kidney, we have two things with us. One is metanephric blastema, which is from metanephros. And we also have this ureteric bud. The ureteric bud, which is derived from the mesonephric duct. Good thing in kidneys, we don't have to bother about endoderm, ectoderm, mesoderm. Everything is mesodermal only. Metanephros is mesoderm. Mesonephric duct coming from mesonephros is also mesodermal. So ureteric bud is also mesodermal. So it's all mesoderm. But still the question is asked that what precisely is derived from the metanephric blastema and what is derived from the ureteric bud. So when you say metanephric blastema, it is actually giving rise to the secretory portion of the kidney. If in one word I say it will give rise to the secretory portion of the kidney, whereas a ureteric bud, it forms the collecting portion or the collecting part of the kidney. So broadly speaking, the secretory part of the kidney or secretory portion of kidney comes from metanephric blastema. That is, you can say ultimately from metanephros, whereas ureteric bud will give rise to the collecting portion of the kidney. Now, when I say secretory portion of kidney, I mean to say Bowman's capsule, ECT, loop of Henle, TCT, and even connecting tubules. Remember this word, guys, connecting tubule. Be careful. Connecting, not collecting. Connecting tubules is coming from the secretory portion, that is from the metanephric blastema. But the collecting portion of the kidney, as I was talking about, this will give rise to the collecting tubule. This will give rise to the collecting tubule. It will give rise to the renal papillae, major and minor calyces, all collecting portion, major and minor calyces. It will give rise to the renal pelvis. Renal pelvis. It will also give rise to the, obviously, to the ureter. That's a ureteric bud we are obviously talking about. So even ureter is derived from this ureteric bud. So all the collecting portion of the collecting portion of the kidney is coming from the ureteric bud, and the secretory portion is all derived from PCT, loop of Henle, DCT. All this is derived from the metanephric blastema. Just as I said, just be a bit careful about this connecting and the collecting thing. And they recently asked this question that the epithelium of ureter is derived from where? Well, you can say ureter is here, right? So epithelium of ureter is derived from where only? That is from the mesonephros. It's invading the metanephros, but derived from where only? From the mesonephros. Mesonephric duct gives rise to the ureteric bud. So ureter, epithelium of ureter is derived from what nephros? That is mesonephros. And not only ureter, everything in the collecting portion. Their epithelium is derived from where? From the mesonephros. That was one of the recent question only. That epithelium of ureter is derived from where? It is from the mesonephros. So guys, we're done with the kidney. We're done with the ureter. Now we already said that the mesonephric duct is getting absorbed inside and giving rise to the trigone of the bladder. Well, trigone of the bladder is also mesodermal. Developmentally is mesodermal, but you can note one thing, that later on, as for Langman says, later on the epithelium of the urogenital sinus, the same epithelium which is covering the urogenital sinus, the endodermal lining that will be having, will also cover the trigone of the bladder. So ultimately, I would say in adult bladder, entirely interior of the bladder is by the endoderm of urogenital sinus. So initially, during the development, it is endodermal mainly. You can see during the development, look at this red color here. So I can say the bladder is endodermal, correct? Trigone is mesodermal because it is derived from the absorption of mesonephric, correct? But later on, the urogenital sinus lining, the endodermal lining of the urogenital sinus will cover the trigone also. So at the end, the picture is that everything in the bladder is actually endodermal. The entire lining of the bladder will be endodermal. So guys, kidney done, ureter done, bladder done, and the trigone and all. Let's go further in that. So let me take the same picture, this urogenital sinus, and talk about the development of the urethra, and especially the questions are asked on the male urethra. So let's also talk about the development of the male urethra. So I'm going to stick to the same color code. Let's say this here is the urogenital sinus. And here is the extension of this urogenital sinus. So this obviously will be the prostatic urethra. If this is a prostate gland, let's say this black color here represents the prostate gland. Different color for that here. So this is a prostatic urethra. That is extent of the prostatic urethra, followed by the small membranous urethra, which is present in a deep perineal pouch. That is a membranous urethra. Then we have this long penile urethra or spongy urethra. And then we got this terminal urethra, which is present in the glands. Prostatic, membranous, spongy. And here's the terminal urethra, which is present in glands. The terminal urethra, which is present in the glands. So guys, this was the urogenital sinus. That's what we said, the urogenital sinus. And we already know that urogenital sinus is all about endoderm, that is endodermal extension. Whereas, look at this, the trigone part inside, which initially was found by the mesoderm. Now, trigone is found by the absorption of mesonephric duct. Well, not only the trigone, there's an extension of this, or you can say the absorption of mesonephric duct goes even further downward in the prostatic urethra till the opening of ejaculatory ducts. This is all about the absorption of what duct? Mesonephric duct, which obviously is mesodermal. That is a mesonephric duct absorbed, forming a trigone, or later on it is covered with endoderm. Okay, that is a different thing. But the same absorption of mesonephric duct even goes into prostatic urethra. You can see it is going into the prostatic urethra till the ejaculatory duct. These are the ejaculatory ducts. These are ejaculatory ducts. So just by looking at this picture, I can make out that prostatic urethra, guys, this prostatic urethra, yes, it is made up of endoderm. You can see that red color there, it indicates the endoderm. But we also have mesoderm in the prostatic urethra. And where is the mesoderm? On which wall? On the posterior wall. Till where? Till ejaculatory ducts. So posterior wall of prostatic urethra till the opening of the ejaculatory duct, it actually is formed by the absorption of mesonephric duct only, so it is mesodermal. Membranous urethra, on the other hand, is purely endodermal. Spongy urethra is also purely endodermal. The penile urethra, the longest part, that is also endodermal. And here's the point. The terminal urethra, this one, the one which is opening in the glans penis, this portion is ectodermal. This portion is ectodermal. Why it is ectodermal? Because glans penis and clitoris, they are derived from something called as genital tubercles. And those genital tubercles have ectodermal thickenings. So obviously urethra opening into an ectodermal thickening will be ectodermal only. So male urethra is, mainly it is endodermal. You can see that. But we do have a mesoderm very much in the proximal part on the posterior wall. And we also have ectoderm in the terminal part of the male urethra, the one which is opening in the glans. So we have all three, endoderm, ectoderm, and you can see there is a mesoderm also is there. That's a special feature of the male urethra, having all three components, and you should know precisely that where is what, endoderm being the dominant component. Now tell me something, guys. What about female urethra? I mean, out of this endoderm, ectoderm, and mesoderm, which component should not be there in the female urethra? Well, mesoderm will be there because trigone is forming in the female bladder also. So the same mesonephric duct will be coming down. We got a urogenital sinus there also. Ectoderm will not be there. Now, why ectoderm is not there in the female urethra? Because male urethra is ectodermal because it is opening in what? It is opening in the glans penis. Female urethra is not opening in clitoris. Clitoris is ectodermal, but urethra is not opening in the clitoris. So there is no ectoderm in female urethra. So we only have mesoderm on the posterior wall and rest is endodermal. If I just make a small note here, talking about the female urethra, in case of female urethra, mesoderm on the posterior wall endoderm on the anterior wall. In fact, rest everything is endodermal except the posterior wall. So we have meso and endo, but there is no ectoderm in female urethra. Okay. Now, we also have some direct questions asked. These are kind of one-liners which are asked on that what is derived from the genital ridge. We use one term called as genital tubercle. Then there is something called as genital swellings and also called as genital folds. So let me just put all these four terminology in front of you. Genital ridge. Something which we just talked about. Genital ridge will give rise to gonads. So genital ridge are the one which gives rise to testis or ovary. Then we use one term called as genital tubercles. Genital tubercles are the one which will give rise to the glands or clitoris. Then there is this genital swellings. Genital swellings. Genital swellings will give rise to the scrotum in male and labia majora in female. And then finally, one more term that you should know, that is genital folds. Genital folds are also called as the urethral folds. Genital folds or the urethral folds. And these genital or urethral fold in male, they will give rise to the ventral aspect of the shaft of the penis. So we will form the ventral aspect of penis. And in female, they'll give rise to the labia minora. Some direct one-liners: genital ridge, tubercles, swellings, and folds. Remember that: ridge, tubercles, swellings, and folds. So guys, this is about the course of the mesonephric duct and what will it give rise to. The kidney, that the certain structures which are common in both male and female. Okay, now talking about the paramesonephric duct, and then we'll also see the remnant of both meso and paramesonephric duct. Paramesonephric duct is having almost the same course, but first of all, we call it paramesonephric duct. Even if you get an image-based question on that, remember, mesonephric duct is more inside and para is outside. That is paramesonephric duct. Paramesonephric duct is a main duct for female. And the difference is that mesonephric duct came down and it invaded the urogenital sinus from the posterior wall, but individually. Right separate, left separate. Paramesonephric duct will come down, will meet with each other, forms a common duct, and that invades the urogenital sinus to form the fallopian tube and the body of the uterus. So when we talk about the fate of the paramesonephric duct, so I got to go with the same thing. This is the paramesonephric duct of the, let's say, the right side, and we have this paramesonephric duct of the left side. And then this paramesonephric duct, it is invading this urogenital sinus. So these are the paramesonephric duct of the right and the left side. And this here is the urogenital sinus. Well, obviously, paramesonephric duct, again, mesodermal, urogenital sinus, endodermal. And this proliferating end of this paramesonephric duct, this is what you call as the this is called as the sinovaginal bulb. That is the sinovaginal bulb. It's called a sinovaginal bulb. So the ultimate picture would be, if I just go directly to that final picture using the same color code, that paramesonephric duct will give rise to the fallopian tube. It will give rise to the fundus, body of the uterus, cervix, vaginal fornices, and upper vaginal wall. And lower vaginal wall, it is derived from the urogenital sinus. So look at this, guys. This portion here till the upper vaginal wall, the fallopian tube, fundus and body of uterus, and the cervix and the vaginal fornices. So all this is derived from the paramesonephric duct, which is mesodermal, whereas the lower part of the vagina, that is derived from the urogenital sinus, and that obviously will be the endodermal. That will be endodermal. So this is the fate of the paramesonephric duct in female. Well, it's a main duct for the female, and we just have remnants in case of the male. So let us talk about that, what remnants we have for the mesonephric duct and what remnants we have for the paramesonephric duct. And even before looking at that list, we can just think about it. When you say mesonephric duct we just discussed is giving rise to the ureteric bud, which is required for both male and female. Mesonephric duct is forming the trigone of the bladder, again required for both male and female. Mesonephric duct is also getting absorbed even below and giving rise to the posterior wall of the urethra, again both in male and female. So till this point, their derivatives are common. But beyond this point, the mesonephric duct is required in what? It is required in male or female? Well, it is required in male. Because mesonephric duct also have to form the spermatic pathway. The vas deferens, epididymis, all that will be derived from where? From the mesonephric duct only. Whereas paramesonephric duct will just have a remnant in case of the female. So look at this list here, and I would like you guys to please take it down. I mean, I'll give you enough time to write it down as well. Look at these derivatives and the remnants of the mesonephric duct and the paramesonephric duct. Now, let me just first try to justify these. Mesonephric duct, which is also called as Wolffian duct. So what are the derivatives we have, guys? Posterior wall of prostatic urethra in male, and similarly we have posterior wall of urethra in female also. Ureteric bud derivative in male, ureteric bud and derivative in female also. Trigone and trigone in female also. So till here it's all common. But beyond this point, look at this. We said in male it will give rise to this spermatic pathway. So all this spermatic pathway, including this appendix of epididymis, this is all derived from the mesonephric duct. Vas deferens, ejaculated duct, the epididymis. Now, what is the appendix of epididymis? If you look at the testis, and this is the head of the epididymis, so you will see a small extension there that is called as the appendix of epididymis. That is also the remnant of the mesonephric duct. Whereas in case of female, mesonephric duct will give rise to what? It will give rise to the duct called as a Gardner's duct or duct of Epiphoron. And please be careful if the question is asked, what is the location of the Gardner's duct? Well, the question may be asked on the Gardner's cyst, which is in the upper vaginal wall. But if the question is asked on the Gardner's duct location, it is present between the two layers of broad ligament. Remember that. It is present between the two layers of broad ligament. So be careful whether the question is on the Gardner's cyst or the Gardner's duct. Gardner's cyst is present in the upper vaginal wall. Gardner's duct, which is a remnant of the mesonephric duct, is derived from the is present at the broad ligament, between the two layers of the broad ligament. So this is about the derivatives of the mesonephric and the mesonephric duct and the remnant. Similarly, paramesonephric duct, guys, what are the derivatives and the remnant of the paramesonephric duct? But there is nothing much in that. When I say paramesonephric duct or Mullerian duct, only female derivatives. You got a fallopian tube, the uterus, and the upper part of vagina. We just discussed that. They're all derived from where? From the parameson. In the male, just remnants. Appendix of testis and the prostatic utricle. Appendix of testis. Just be careful, guys. Appendix of epididymis is derived from something which is giving rise to epididymis. That is mesonephric duct. This is the appendix of testis we are talking about. That is derived from the paramesonephric duct, along with prostatic utricle. What is prostatic utricle? I mean, if you look at the prostatic urethra, which we'll discuss separately also, if there's a prostatic urethra, we have two ejaculated ducts, and between the two ejaculated ducts, there is one blind opening. This blind opening on the posterior wall of the prostatic urethra is called as the prostatic utricle. And you know, the prostatic utricle actually corresponds to the uterus and vagina in female. So it's like a remnant of the structures which is giving rise to uterus and vagina in the female, and that remnant is in male also. So sometimes we also call it the masculine vagina. the prostatic utricle, it can also be referred as the masculine or the male vagina. So that is about the derivatives of the mesonephric duct and the paramesonephric duct. And with that, we conclude the development of the GIT as well as the urogenital system.